a former NFL player once celebrated for his strength and speed, now stands infamous for a brutal crime. This is the story of Kevin Ware Jr. and Taylor Pomaski, a tale of promise wasted, love turned violent, and a young woman's life stolen in the most tragic way imaginable. Kevin Ware Jr. was once known as a promising young athlete. Born and raised in Texas, he pursued a career in professional football, and for a short time, he lived the dream of many young men who dedicate their lives to sports. As a tight end, he played briefly in the National Football League, first for the San Francisco 49ers and later for Washington, back when the team was still known as the Redskins. His time in the NFL was short-lived, and his career never became the success story many thought it could be. After leaving professional sports, Ware's life began to spiral in ways that would ultimately make his name known not for football, but for a violent crime that shocked the public and devastated a young woman's family. By 2021, Ware was 41 years old and living in Texas. He was no longer an athlete in the spotlight, but instead a man with a troubled past and an unstable present. His life was marked by run-ins with the law, accusations of violent behavior, and drug-related charges. Those who knew him in later years described a man whose potential had slipped away, replaced by volatility, anger, and poor choices. Despite this background, he was in a relationship with Taylor Pomaski, a 29-year-old woman also living in Texas. Taylor was young, social, and described by friends and family as someone with energy and warmth. She became close to Ware, and though many did not fully understand what she saw in him, she maintained the relationship even as tensions sometimes rose between them. It was a connection that would eventually put her life in danger. In late April of 2021, Taylor Pomaski was seen at a gathering in the Houston area. It was a house party where friends, acquaintances, and neighbors gathered for drinks, music, and conversation. For many, it seemed like a typical evening, but for Taylor, this night would mark the last time she was ever seen alive. Witnesses recalled arguments and moments of tension, and before long, Taylor disappeared from the event. At first, people assumed she had simply left the party early or gone somewhere else without notice. But as days turned into weeks, her absence became more troubling. Her family quickly realized something was wrong. Taylor was not the kind of person to vanish without explanation, and soon they were raising alarms and contacting authorities. When investigators first looked into Taylor's disappearance, their attention naturally turned to those closest to her. Kevin Ware was one of the last people known to have seen her. His history with law enforcement raised suspicion almost immediately. Ware had already been facing legal issues unrelated to Taylor's disappearance, and his pattern of behavior painted a picture that investigators could not ignore. He was questioned and watched closely, but without a body or clear evidence, the case remained uncertain. Friends of Taylor reported troubling details, noting that the relationship had not always been smooth. There were concerns about Ware's temper and his treatment of her, though at the time of her disappearance, little could be proven. For Taylor's family, the uncertainty was unbearable. They were left waiting for any news while fearing the worst. Months passed with no sign of Taylor. Authorities in Harris County and surrounding areas continued their search, using every lead they could find. Meanwhile, Ware found himself in and out of custody on other charges. His criminal history was lengthy, including weapons violations and drug possession, and his arrest record kept him under the scrutiny of law enforcement. Still, nothing tied him directly to Taylor's vanishing. For Taylor's loved ones, the silence was tormenting. They continued to plead for information and asked the public for help. Each passing day made the outcome feel more grim, but until concrete evidence was discovered, her case remained in limbo. That changed in December 2021, when human remains were discovered in a wooded area in Harris County. Investigators recovered the remains and sent them for forensic analysis. It would take months to receive confirmation, but eventually, the results left no doubt. The remains were identified as belonging to Taylor Pomaski. The announcement devastated her family, though many had already feared the worst. The confirmation meant that Taylor had not simply gone missing by choice or circumstance. She had been murdered. And with that confirmation, the investigation shifted dramatically. What had started as a missing person case was now a homicide, and suspicion toward Kevin were hardened into a central focus. By this point, Ware was already in custody on unrelated matters, but the discovery of Taylor's body gave prosecutors and investigators a much stronger case. They began piecing together the timeline of her disappearance, Ware's actions, and his violent history. Friends and witnesses recalled the heated arguments between him and Taylor, and prosecutors began to use these accounts as part of their narrative. The fact that Ware had been connected to Taylor at the party where she was last seen, combined with his criminal past, made him the prime suspect. The tragedy of Taylor's murder struck a chord in Texas and beyond, as the story gained national attention. It was not only the brutal end of a young woman's life, but also a reminder of the dangers of domestic violence and abusive relationships. For the public, the story was deeply unsettling because of who Kevin Ware had once been. He was not simply another man accused of murder. He was a former NFL player, someone who had once worn a professional jersey and stood on a national stage. His fall from the promise of an athletic career to the reality of violent crime reflected a troubling pattern that some athletes face after their careers end. Ware's name, once associated with football, now became tied to tragedy, violence, and a case that exposed the darker sides of his personal life. For Taylor Pomaski's family, however, the focus was never on his past in the NFL. Their attention remained on finding justice for Taylor, a young woman who deserved far more than the fate she met. The turning point in the case was the recovery of Taylor's remains, but the years that followed would bring further developments. Prosecutors took their time building a case that would stand in court, relying on both direct and circumstantial evidence. Ware initially denied involvement, maintaining his innocence, but the strength of the investigation placed increasing pressure on him. What had begun as suspicions against him eventually became a murder indictment, and though the wheels of justice turned slowly, the outcome seemed inevitable. As the legal process advanced, Ware faced growing public attention and scrutiny. His past, his career, and his downfall were dissected in headlines, but at the heart of the story was Taylor Pomaski, a 29-year-old woman whose life ended far too soon. Friends described her as warm, social, and loving, someone who deserved to be remembered for who she was, not just as a victim of violence. The tragedy drew attention to issues of domestic violence, the vulnerability of women in abusive relationships, and the dangers that often go unseen until it is too late. By the end of 2021, the case had shifted from uncertainty to grim clarity. Taylor was gone, Ware was in custody, and investigators had the foundation they needed to move forward. But for Taylor's family, the journey toward justice was only just beginning. They had answers about what had happened, but the legal system still had to deliver accountability. For the public, the story of Kevin Ware Jr. and Taylor Pomaski was no longer just about a missing woman or a troubled former athlete. It had become a story of violence, loss, and the relentless work of investigators determined to uncover the truth. When Taylor Pomaski's remains were confirmed in early 2022, the case officially transitioned from a missing person search to a homicide investigation. For her family, the confirmation, though devastating, provided a painful kind of closure to the uncertainty they had endured for months. But alongside their grief came a renewed determination to see justice done. Authorities in Harris County focused their efforts squarely on Kevin Ware Jr., the man who had been linked to Taylor from the beginning. By this point, he was already in custody on unrelated charges, which gave investigators some room to develop their case without the risk of him disappearing. They began piecing together a timeline of events, looking into his past, and gathering witness accounts to build a picture of what might have happened to Taylor on that April night in 2021. The relationship between Taylor and Kevin had always been a point of concern for her friends. People close to Taylor described the couple's dynamic as rocky, filled with moments of tension and conflict. Arguments were frequent, and some of them escalated to the point where friends worried about Taylor's safety. Kevin's temper was well known, and his history of violent behavior only deepened suspicions. Although Taylor was independent and strong-willed, she was also in a relationship with a man who had a reputation for volatility. For investigators, this history provided critical context. They could not rely on a single piece of evidence to make their case. Instead, they needed to gather every possible detail about the days and weeks leading up to Taylor's disappearance and about Kevin's actions afterward. Witness statements played a key role. People who had been at the party in April 2021 recalled that tensions between Kevin and Taylor were visible that night. Some described heated exchanges, while others remembered Taylor looking distressed. It wasn't clear what exactly had sparked the arguments, but those who saw them unfold later told investigators that it left them uneasy. When Taylor vanished after that night, the unease turned into suspicion. The fact that Kevin was one of the last people known to have seen her alive tied him even more firmly to the case. As investigators pressed on, they found themselves returning to the same conclusion. All signs pointed back to him. Meanwhile, Kevin Ware's history was examined in greater detail. Before Taylor's disappearance, he had already been in frequent contact with law enforcement. His past included drug charges, weapons violations, and a reputation for violence. These weren't just minor scrapes with the law. They painted a pattern of behavior that prosecutors could use to demonstrate his capacity for serious harm. Ware's time in the NFL had long been overshadowed by his off-field issues, and now his record was a significant piece of the puzzle. For the prosecution, his history of aggression and disregard for the law would help establish motive and character when the time came for trial. The investigation gained momentum when forensic work confirmed Taylor's remains. Although the exact cause of death was difficult to determine due to the time that had passed, the location and condition of the body raised red flags. Taylor hadn't simply wandered off. She had been disposed of in a wooded area, an action investigators argued could only be explained by foul play. The discovery itself was the turning point that transformed suspicions into a more definitive case. Authorities began preparing charges, and in 2022, Kevin Ware Jr. was indicted for Taylor Pomaski's murder. The indictment marked a major development, signaling that the state believed it had enough evidence to take Ware to trial. For Taylor's family, the indictment was both a relief and a fresh wound. They had fought tirelessly to keep attention on her case, speaking out publicly and urging authorities not to let her story fade. The news that Ware had been formally charged gave them hope that justice would finally be within reach. Still, they also knew the legal process would be long and painful. Each hearing and filing would bring Taylor's story back into the spotlight, forcing them to relive their grief. Even so, they stood firm, determined to see it through. Ware, on the other hand, initially maintained his innocence. Through his legal team, he entered a plea of not guilty. This was not unexpected, as many defendants in high-profile cases do the same in the early stages. His defense argued that there was no direct evidence tying him to Taylor's death, pointing out that the condition of the remains left many unanswered questions. They hinted that the prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and Kevin's past rather than concrete proof. For a time, this strategy seemed designed to delay proceedings and test the strength of the state's case. But prosecutors were prepared for this. They leaned on witness accounts, Ware's criminal background and the circumstances surrounding Taylor's disappearance to hold their ground. Throughout 2022 and 2023, hearings and legal motions shaped the path toward trial. The process was slow, as is often the case with murder trials, especially ones that draw public attention. Each delay frustrated Taylor's family, but also gave prosecutors more time to solidify their evidence. The community, meanwhile, watched closely. News outlets followed every update, reporting on court appearances, motions, and reactions. Kevin Ware's name, once a footnote in NFL history, had become a headline synonymous with violence and tragedy. Public opinion leaned heavily against him, influenced not only by the facts of the case, but also by his checkered past. Investigators worked to connect every possible detail to strengthen their case. They traced Kevin's movements, looked into his behavior following Taylor's disappearance, and analyzed his interactions with others. They also considered his arrests on unrelated charges during the same period. While these arrests were not directly tied to Taylor's murder, they painted a picture of a man living recklessly and without regard for the law. To the prosecution, this behavior was not just background noise. It was part of a consistent pattern that made the accusations against him more credible. By the time the case moved further into 2024, the weight of evidence against Kevin seemed overwhelming. The prosecution was prepared to argue that his violent tendencies, his relationship with Taylor, and the discovery of her remains all pointed to his guilt. They were ready to present a case built on both direct testimony and the broader context of his life. The defense continued to insist there were gaps in the evidence, but the public narrative was not on their side. For most observers, Ware was already guilty in their eyes, even if the court had yet to make it official. Behind the headlines, the emotional toll on Taylor's family was enormous. They had endured years of waiting, searching, and grieving, only to face the drawn-out reality of the court system. Every update in the case forced them to confront the details of her death and the man accused of causing it. Still, they remained steadfast, attending hearings and speaking out when necessary to ensure Taylor's story was not forgotten. Their persistence highlighted not just the tragedy of Taylor's loss, but also the resilience of families who fight for justice in the aftermath of violence. As the case edged closer to trial, Kevin Ware faced the possibility of spending decades behind bars if convicted. For a man who had once stood on professional football fields, it was a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. The courtroom, rather than the stadium, became the stage where his name would be remembered. The story of Kevin Ware and Taylor Pomaski was no longer about potential or promise. It was about violence, loss, and accountability. The indictment and legal battles laid the foundation for the final chapter of this case, where the truth of Taylor's fate and Ware's responsibility would ultimately be decided. By the close of 2024, years after Taylor first went missing, the pieces of the case were firmly in place. The evidence had been gathered, the charges had been set, and both sides prepared for what was to come. For the prosecution, the case represented the culmination of years of work to bring justice to a young woman whose life had been cut short. For the defense, it was a battle to challenge the narrative and argue that reasonable doubt still existed. And for Taylor's family, it was another step in their long journey to see justice delivered in her name. The courtroom drama was set to unfold, and though no outcome could undo the tragedy, the legal system would soon determine Kevin Ware's fate. As the case entered its final phase in 2025, Kevin Ware Jr. faced the reality that his legal options were narrowing. For years, he had denied responsibility for Taylor Pomaski's death, maintaining his not guilty plea and allowing his defense attorneys to argue that the case against him was built on circumstantial evidence. But the weight of the investigation, the testimony of witnesses, and the mounting pressure from prosecutors left little room for maneuver. The evidence may not have been a single damning piece that could stand on its own, but taken together, it was overwhelming. The picture painted by investigators was one of a violent man with a history of aggression who was the last person to be seen with Taylor before she vanished, and who then offered no credible explanation for her disappearance. For Ware, the courtroom became a place where the walls began closing in. Prosecutors were prepared to put his entire life on display, not just the details of Taylor's death, but his violent past, his arrests, and his troubled history after leaving professional football. They argued that his pattern of behavior pointed clearly to the kind of man who could commit such a crime. The defense continued to raise questions, pressing on the lack of direct physical evidence, tying him to Taylor's remains. But juries and judges are swayed not just by forensic evidence, but by the broader story. And the story of Kevin Ware was not one that leaned in his favor. He was a man who had squandered his opportunities, turned to reckless and destructive behavior, and left destruction in his wake. In 2025, Ware changed his plea. After years of proclaiming innocence, he stood in court and admitted guilt. He pleaded guilty to killing Taylor Pomaski, confirming what her family and investigators had believed since her remains were first discovered in Harris County. The plea marked the end of years of speculation and legal maneuvering. There would be no dramatic trial with witness after witness called to the stand. No lengthy battle over forensic reports and timelines. Instead, there was a simple, grim acknowledgement from Ware himself that he had ended Taylor's life. For Taylor's family, the moment was both devastating and relieving. They had long suspected and believed the truth, but hearing it spoken aloud by the man responsible was a confirmation that carried both weight and finality. The courtroom, when the plea was entered, was heavy with emotion. Members of Taylor's family were present, listening as the man who had once been part of her life admitted to taking it. The prosecutors, who had worked for years to secure this moment, made it clear that the plea was not just a legal technicality, but a statement of accountability. Ware's admission meant that Taylor's story was no longer left in the shadow of uncertainty. He had killed her, and now he would face the punishment for it. The sentencing followed soon after. The court handed down a 30-year prison sentence to Kevin Ware Jr. for a man who was already in his early 40s. The punishment effectively removed him from society for the rest of his life. The sentence was not a life term, but it was long enough that freedom in any meaningful sense would not return until he was an old man, if at all. For Taylor's family, the sentence could not bring her back, but it gave them the justice they had fought for since the day she disappeared. It was a measure of accountability for the violent end of a young woman's life and a signal that Kevin Ware could no longer harm anyone else. As news of the plea and sentencing spread, the story was widely covered by national and local outlets. Ware's name once again appeared in headlines, but this time not as a former NFL player with potential or as a man facing charges. Instead, he was now defined by his crime and the sentence that followed. His football career, short-lived and largely forgotten, was now only a footnote in a larger narrative of violence, abuse, and downfall. The public saw him as another cautionary tale of wasted talent, of someone who once stood on a national stage only to fall into a life of crime and eventually murder. For Taylor Pomaski's family and friends, the end of the case meant they could finally grieve without the constant weight of uncertainty. They had spent years in limbo, first searching for Taylor, then waiting for confirmation of her fate, and finally enduring the slow process of the court system. The plea and sentencing did not erase their pain, but it allowed them to begin the process of healing, knowing that the man responsible was behind bars. They spoke of Taylor as someone who deserved to be remembered for her spirit, her kindness, and her life, not just the violent circumstances of her death. The broader theme of the case echoed beyond Taylor's family. Domestic violence advocates pointed to her story as a tragic example of the dangers faced by women in abusive or toxic relationships. The fact that Taylor had been in a relationship with a man like Ware, whose past showed clear warning signs, highlighted the risks that can often be overlooked until it is too late. Her death became part of a larger conversation about how society responds to domestic violence, how law enforcement can intervene, and how communities can better support women who find themselves in dangerous situations. For those who once followed Ware's athletic career, the case was a stark reminder of how quickly a life of promise can turn into one of ruin. He had the physical talent and the opportunity to build a long career in professional sports, yet choices and behaviors off the field undermined every step. His story reflected the harsh reality that athletic success cannot shield someone from their own destructive tendencies. In the end, his name would not be remembered for catches or touchdowns, but for the brutal act that ended the life of a young woman. The conclusion of the case also served as a warning about how violence can escalate when unchecked. Ware's history of aggression and criminal charges had been documented for years, but it was Taylor Pomaski who ultimately paid the highest price. Her death was the culmination of a cycle of behavior that had been visible long before. The sentence delivered in 2025 was not just for Taylor's murder, but symbolically for every instance of violence that had led to that point. It was society's way of drawing a line and declaring that such actions would not go unanswered. Even as the courtroom emptied and Ware was led away to serve his sentence, the echoes of the case lingered. The family left with a measure of justice, but also with a permanent absence that could never be filled. The community reflected on the loss of a woman whose life had been stolen, and the country noted another high-profile case of a former athlete whose name was now tied to tragedy. In the end, the story of Kevin, where Junior and Taylor Pomaski was one of contrasts. Potential turned to waste, love turned to violence, and a promising young woman's life turned into a devastating headline. What remained was the theme that had defined the story from the beginning. It was about domestic violence, about the dangers of abusive relationships, and about the consequences of ignoring warning signs. It was about the reality that fame and athletic ability cannot erase violent behavior. And above all, it was about justice, delayed but not denied, for Taylor Pomaski, whose family refused to let her story be forgotten. The 30-year sentence handed to Kevin Ware Jr. ensured that he would live out most of his remaining days behind bars, a fallen athlete defined not by his fleeting time in the NFL, but by the crime that ended Taylor's life. For the family who loved her, for the investigators who worked tirelessly on her case, and for the public who followed the story, the resolution marked the close of a dark chapter, leaving only the memory of a young woman whose life should have been far longer and brighter than it was allowed to be. A beloved mother found dead on Valentine's Day. A former football star turned prosecutor accused of murder years later. Twists of love, betrayal, and shocking courtroom drama leave one haunting question. Was it illness or cold-blooded suffocation? The truth hides in Quincy's most chilling mystery. On a cold morning in Quincy, Illinois, Valentine's Day of 2006 began like any other for Curtis "Kurt" Lovelace and his wife, Corey. Quincy was a quiet Midwestern river town where people knew each other, and the Lovelace family was well known. Curtis had grown up in the area and earned a reputation as both an athlete and a professional. In his younger years, he had been a celebrated football player at the University of Illinois. Later, he built a career as a prosecutor and local official. People in Quincy recognized his name and often viewed him as someone with a bright future and influence in the community. At home, life was centered around family. Corey, at 38 years old, was a full-time mother. She and Curtis were raising 4 children. The eldest, Lindsay, and their 3 sons, Logan, Lincoln, and Larson. Friends described Corey as warm and loving, but she also faced difficult battles with personal demons. She struggled with alcoholism and bulimia, challenges that became part of her daily life. She tried to balance motherhood with her own health struggles, but by early 2006 her body was under significant strain. She had severe fatty liver disease, was not in good health, and in the days leading up to Valentine's Day had been feeling ill with flu-like symptoms. That morning, the family's routine unfolded as usual. Around 8:15 a.m., Curtis left home to take 3 of their children to school. When he returned about 20 minutes later, nothing seemed out of place. Shortly after 9 a.m., however, everything changed. Curtis discovered Corey in their bed, unresponsive. She wasn't breathing. Emergency responders were called, but there was nothing they could do. Corey Lovelace was declared dead in the home. Investigators examined the scene and found no obvious signs of trauma. There were no marks of violence, no injuries that pointed to foul play. The autopsy did not provide clear answers either. With her medical history, alcohol use, bulimia, her weakened liver, doctors and police leaned toward natural causes. The official conclusion was that Corey's death was undetermined, but in practical terms, the case was closed. There were no charges, no suspicions raised publicly, and no reason to keep the file open. For Curtis and his children, it was a devastating personal tragedy. Life moved forward, at least on the surface. Curtis continued his legal career, raising his children and trying to provide them with stability after their loss. The community saw him as a man who had faced heartbreak but was moving on. For the children, it was the reality of growing up without their mother. The house where Corey once bustled with activity now carried the silence of her absence. Years passed. Quincy changed in small ways, but the memory of Corey's death lingered quietly in the background. Nothing about it appeared unusual enough to reopen the matter. Yet in 2013, 7 years after she died, Detective Adam Gibson of the Quincy Police Department began looking again at the old case. He studied the original photographs from the death scene. What others had viewed as an ordinary posture of a body at rest struck him differently. To Gibson, Corey's position looked unnatural. Her arms held in a way that suggested she may have been suffocated, possibly with a pillow. Gibson consulted experts who reinforced his suspicions. He believed the signs of rigor mortis and other details supported the theory that Corey had not died naturally at all. He brought his concerns to Coroner James Keller, who reviewed the case and reached a similar conclusion. Together, they argued that what had once been seen as illness could instead be explained as homicide. The reopening of the investigation shook the case loose from the past. Suddenly, Corey's death was no longer a closed chapter. It was being re-examined as a possible murder, and the focus quickly turned toward Curtis. Detectives suggested that marital strain and tension in the home could have motivated him. The picture of the successful prosecutor and former athlete began to blur with darker accusations. By August 2014, the shift was complete. Authorities arrested Curtis Lovelace and charged him with first-degree murder in the death of his wife. Nearly a decade after Corey was buried, Curtis was now accused of killing her. For Quincy, it was a startling reversal. The man who had prosecuted cases in the same courthouse was now a defendant himself, facing the most serious of charges. As the case prepared for trial, both sides lined up their experts and witnesses. Prosecutors insisted that Curtis suffocated his wife and concealed it by claiming she had died in her sleep. They argued that the body's condition supported their timeline and that his marriage to Corey had been filled with conflict. Defense attorneys pushed back, pointing to Corey's history of alcoholism, her eating disorder, and her fragile health as a more than sufficient explanation for her death. They highlighted her severe fatty liver disease and her illness in the days before she passed as evidence that no crime had occurred. The trial began in January 2016 in Quincy. After years of speculation and silence, the courtroom became the setting where all the questions were finally aired. Jurors listened to medical testimony, family memories, and conflicting expert opinions. The state pressed its claim that suffocation was the only logical explanation. The defense countered that the prosecution was stretching limited evidence to fit a theory that ignored the real and documented health problems Corey had endured. When the jury deliberated, the divide was clear. Some jurors found the prosecution's case persuasive. Others felt the defense had raised enough doubt. They could not come to a unanimous decision. The jury deadlocked, and the judge declared a mistrial. The mistrial meant the story was far from over. Curtis remained under indictment, and prosecutors quickly prepared to try the case again. The prospect of a retrial loomed, and with it, the possibility of either conviction or acquittal. For the Lovelace family, and for Quincy, the case continued to stir questions that had no easy answers. When the first trial of Curtis Lovelace ended in a mistrial in 2016, the atmosphere around Quincy shifted. People who had once known him as a football hero or respected prosecutor were now divided. Some believed that the state had finally uncovered the truth about Corey's death, while others thought Curtis was being unfairly targeted years after the tragedy. The mistrial left everything unresolved. For prosecutors, it meant regrouping and preparing for another attempt. For Curtis, it meant living in limbo, his name still tied to the charge of murdering his wife. The second trial was not going to happen in Quincy. The case had drawn enormous attention in the community, and many residents had connections to Curtis, through his work, his family, or simply his long-standing presence in town. To avoid the influence of local opinions, the proceedings were moved to Springfield, Illinois, about 120 miles away. This change in location gave the trial a different setting, but the stakes remained the same. Curtis faced the possibility of life in prison if convicted. By this point, Curtis's personal life had also changed. After Corey's death, he remarried twice. His second marriage, to Erica Gomez, had ended in divorce. The relationship had been difficult, and prosecutors sought to use it against him. They argued that his behavior in that marriage showed a pattern that made their theory of homicide more believable. Erica was called to testify, describing what she said were instances of control and mistreatment. For the prosecution, Her testimony was meant to provide context, painting Curtis as a man capable of cruelty behind closed doors. But the defense countered that Erica's testimony was not only unreliable but irrelevant. They argued that the trial was about Corey's death in 2006, not about later difficulties in a separate marriage. Curtis's third wife, Christine, whom he married in 2013, stood firmly by his side. She attended court, publicly supported him, and openly criticized the claims made by Erica and the prosecution's approach. For Christine, Curtis was a man wrongly accused, a husband and father caught in a system determined to make him guilty without sufficient evidence. The prosecution's case in Springfield centered heavily on expert testimony. They pointed to photographs of Corey's body taken the morning she died. In particular, they focused on the position of her arms and the stiffness they believed indicated an earlier time of death than Curtis had claimed. They argued that her condition showed she had died before Curtis took the children to school, suggesting his timeline was false. Medical experts called by the state described the possibility of suffocation, explaining that such a death might leave few visible marks. The defense attacked those conclusions as speculative and unreliable. They reminded the jury of Corey's long battle with alcoholism and bulimia. They emphasized her severely damaged liver and her poor health in the days before her death. According to the defense, Corey's body was simply breaking down after years of illness, and her death was tragic but not criminal. They challenged the credibility of the state's experts, noting that other medical professionals had previously found no clear evidence of foul play. Throughout the trial, Curtis sat quietly, listening to the accusations. He had once stood on the other side of a courtroom as a prosecutor. Now he faced the reality of being judged by strangers who held his future in their hands. Reporters noted how the retrial carried an air of tension, not just for Curtis, but for the jurors tasked with weighing evidence that was old, complicated, and deeply contested. Witnesses were brought forward to testify about the Lovelace home, about Corey's health, and about Curtis's actions the day she died. The children's recollections from 2006 were part of the record, including their memories of seeing their mother alive that morning before school. This detail mattered because it supported Curtis's claim that Corey was still alive when he left with the children, a direct contradiction of the prosecution's timeline. The defense also highlighted the delay in reopening the case. They asked why, if the evidence of suffocation was so clear, no one had noticed it back in 2006. Why had it taken 7 years for detectives to reframe the story as murder? They suggested that the case was built not on hard evidence, but on interpretations shaped by hindsight and by investigators who had already decided what they wanted to find. As days of testimony stretched on, the courtroom became a stage where two completely different versions of the same morning were presented. In one version, Curtis was a husband who had finally snapped under the weight of marital strain, using a pillow to smother his wife before sending his children off to school. In the other, he was a man who woke to a terrible reality, that his wife, weakened by years of illness, had simply died in her sleep, leaving him to face grief, suspicion, and now the possibility of conviction. The jury listened as both sides made their closing arguments. The prosecution asked them to focus on the photographs, the timeline, and the medical opinions that pointed to suffocation. The defense urged them to look at Corey's documented medical history, her alcoholism, her eating disorder, and the very real possibility that her body had failed her on its own. Every element of the trial carried weight. The testimony of Erica Gomez, the support of Christine, the children's memories, the medical experts contradicting one another. All of it was put before the jurors to consider. When the lawyers finished, the responsibility shifted to those 12 people to decide which version of events they believed. For Curtis, waiting on a verdict meant confronting the uncertainty of his entire future. He had been living under suspicion since 2014, his life, reputation, and career unraveling under the weight of the charge. For the families involved, including Corey's relatives and the Lovelace children, the retrial represented another painful chapter in a story that had begun more than a decade earlier. The second trial became a battle of interpretation. hinging on the same central question that had haunted the case since 2006. Had Corey died naturally from her illnesses, or had she been suffocated in her bed on Valentine's Day? Each side insisted their explanation was the only one supported by the facts. Each side urged the jury to see the other's version as incomplete, biased, or simply wrong. The proceedings in Springfield unfolded with the same mixture of legal precision and human drama that defined the first trial. But this time, the jurors carried the weight of resolving a question that had divided not just a courtroom, but an entire community. When the retrial of Curtis Lovelace began in Springfield, Illinois, the weight of 11 years of suspicion and unanswered questions loomed heavily over the courtroom. Unlike the first trial in Quincy, this one was moved to ensure a jury that would not be influenced by local ties, gossip, or Curtis's own history as a prosecutor in the same courthouse. The eyes of Quincy were still on him, but the setting was new, and the stakes were even higher. If convicted, Curtis faced life in prison. If acquitted, he might finally reclaim a life that had been overshadowed since Corey's death in 2006. The prosecution once again leaned heavily on medical testimony and crime scene photographs. They told the jury that Corey's body showed signs of suffocation, that the stiffened positioning of her arms suggested she had died earlier than Curtis claimed, and that the only plausible explanation was that he had killed her before taking their children to school. They wove a narrative of a strained marriage, painting Curtis as a man frustrated with Corey's alcoholism, tired of her decline, and ultimately capable of murder. To strengthen their case, they brought in testimony from his second wife, Erica Gomez, who described moments of control and intimidation during their marriage. The defense challenged every point. They reminded the jury that Corey had been in fragile health for years, battling alcoholism and bulimia. Her liver was severely compromised, her body already failing, and in the days before her death, she had been weak and ill. According to the defense, her death was tragic but not suspicious. They argued that the prosecution's experts were cherry-picked and biased, interpreting old photographs through the lens of a conclusion they had already decided upon. They pointed to the fact that in 2006, no pathologist, coroner, or investigator had found clear signs of suffocation. The case had been reopened only after years of silence, based on the interpretations of new investigators who wanted to make their mark. Curtis's third wife, Christine, sat in the courtroom every day, a visible sign of loyalty and support. She spoke openly in defense of her husband, calling the accusations baseless and publicly criticizing the way prosecutors used Erica Gomez's testimony. For Christine, the trial was not only about proving Curtis's innocence, but about protecting his dignity against what she saw as a campaign of character assassination. The retrial highlighted the difficulty of building a murder case without physical evidence. There were no injuries on Corey's body, no DNA, no confession, and no eyewitnesses. All the state had were photographs, expert opinions, and a theory shaped by the belief that Curtis had motive and opportunity. The defense stressed this to the jury. If there had been suffocation, why were there no physical marks? Why had no one in 2006 said so? Why had investigators waited 7 years to change their conclusion? For the jury, the deliberations became a test of credibility. They had to weigh experts who contradicted one another, sift through medical terms, and decide whose version of events carried more truth. The prosecution asked them to accept that a man who seemed respectable in public could have been violent in private. The defense asked them to see the flaws in the investigation and the natural explanations for Corey's death. After days of deliberation, the verdict was read, not guilty. Curtis Lovelace was acquitted of the murder of his wife. The decision was met with relief from his supporters and disappointment from those who still believed in the prosecution's theory. For Curtis, it meant freedom after years of uncertainty, but the scars of the ordeal would remain. The acquittal did not erase the strain the case had put on his family. His children had lost their mother and then spent years watching their father accused of killing her. They had endured 2 trials, endless speculation, and the division of public opinion. Some supported their father fully, while others carried their own private doubts and pain. For them, the courtroom battles were not just about justice, but about surviving a story that had consumed their lives since childhood. After the trial, Curtis sought to rebuild. He returned to Quincy with Christine, determined to move on. Yet the shadow of the case followed him. Public opinion in Quincy remained divided. Some residents felt he had been vindicated, while others whispered that the jury had let a guilty man go free. The lingering uncertainty was a wound that could not be neatly closed. Curtis did not stop with the acquittal. He filed a civil rights lawsuit against Adams County and the Quincy Police Department, claiming malicious prosecution and wrongful arrest. He argued that investigators had pursued him without solid evidence, relying on flawed interpretations and personal bias. The lawsuit was a way for Curtis to reclaim some of what he had lost: his reputation, his career, and his peace of mind. In the end, he won. A settlement of $4.5 million was awarded, a powerful acknowledgement that the handling of the case had caused him real damage. But even with financial compensation and legal vindication, the case of Corey Lovelace's death remains unresolved in the eyes of many. Her death certificate does not list suffocation as a cause, yet the questions raised by the prosecution continue to linger. Was it illness, the final collapse of a body weakened by years of struggle? Or was it something darker that no jury could prove? The absence of clear answers keeps the story alive, not just as a legal case, but as a mystery that haunts Quincy to this day. The story raises broader issues about the criminal justice system. How do you prosecute a case when the physical evidence is nearly non-existent? How reliable are medical opinions formed years after the fact, based only on photographs and second-hand reports? And how do you balance the pursuit of justice with the rights of the accused, especially when the accused is someone who once stood on the other side of the courtroom as a prosecutor? For Curtis, the years after his acquittal have been about recovery. He continues to live with Christine, working to move forward after the trials that defined his life for nearly a decade. For Corey, her memory remains at the center of the story, not only as a victim of an untimely death, but as a figure whose life and struggles were dissected in public courtrooms. The case of death on Valentine's Day is remembered as one of Quincy's most unsettling mysteries. It is a story of love turned tragic, of a family broken by loss, and of a courtroom drama that tested the boundaries of evidence and belief. It is about the fragile line between natural tragedy and criminal suspicion, a line that can shift depending on who interprets the facts. Even today, the community and those who follow the case remain divided. To some, the acquittal is proof that justice was served, that Curtis Lovelace was innocent all along. To others, it is a reminder of how difficult it can be to convict in the absence of concrete evidence, leaving a lingering suspicion that something was missed. Curtis's journey through accusation, trial, mistrial, and acquittal shows how fragile reputations can be, how easily grief can turn into suspicion, and how uncertain the search for truth can become. Corey's death, on a holiday meant to celebrate love, remains both a family tragedy and a legal riddle. And in Quincy, Illinois, it is remembered not only as a case of law, but as a story that left an entire town questioning what really happened on Valentine's Day. In the quiet mountains of Park City, Utah, a former pro football player and his young wife checked into a hotel. By morning, she was dead, stabbed in a violent struggle. He claimed confusion, told conflicting stories, but evidence revealed a darker truth. This is the case of Anthony McClanahan. Anthony McClanahan's life had once been defined by speed, strength, and the promise of a career in professional football. Born in California and raised with a passion for the sport, he worked hard to reach the level most athletes only dream of. By the mid-1990s, his talent carried him into the NFL, where he briefly spent time with the Dallas Cowboys as a linebacker. Though his career there never fully took off, he found more success in the Canadian Football League, where his athletic ability and drive gave him recognition on the field. He was a man who had touched the spotlight, who had experienced the power and respect that came with being a professional athlete. But by 2017, Anthony's life looked very different. He was 46 years old, no longer the rising star of his youth. Instead, he was living in Park City, Utah, a city known for its scenic mountains and ski culture, far removed from the roar of stadium crowds. In his personal life, Anthony had remarried. His wife, Carrie Casey McClanahan, was just 28 years old. Much younger than Anthony, Carrie worked in education, where she was known for her kindness, her energy, and her dedication to students and children. She was also a devoted mother of 2 young children from a previous relationship. Friends and family described her as warm, giving, and determined to balance her roles as a mother, a professional, and a partner. From the outside, their marriage appeared like any other. Pictures on social media showed smiling faces, vacations, and moments that looked happy. To those who only glanced at their lives from a distance, it was the image of a couple building a future together. But beneath the surface, there were cracks. Friends and relatives would later share that Anthony had a controlling nature. Arguments between him and Carrie were not rare. The age gap between them, combined with Anthony's strong personality, created tension. Carrie was young, still carving out her independence and raising her children, while Anthony struggled to let go of the authority and dominance he had been used to throughout his life. In the weeks leading up to November 2017, people close to Carrie noticed her unease. Family members later said she had voiced concerns about Anthony's behavior and the strain it put on their relationship. But like many women in difficult marriages, she tried to manage the situation, keeping her focus on her children and her work. On November 2, 2017, Anthony and Carrie checked into the Park Regency Hotel in Park City, Utah. What should have been an ordinary evening soon spiraled into violence. At some point during the night, a heated argument erupted in their hotel room. What began as words escalated into rage, and in that enclosed space, Anthony turned violent. He attacked Carrie with a knife, stabbing her repeatedly. Investigators later said that Carrie fought desperately for her life. The injuries on her body showed signs of resistance, proof that she tried to defend herself against the man who should have protected her. But the assault was relentless, and the outcome was fatal. Carrie's life was taken in that room, leaving her 2 children without a mother. The aftermath of the attack revealed Anthony's attempts to cover his actions. When authorities were called and arrived at the hotel, Anthony gave conflicting accounts of what had happened. At first, he suggested that others had been involved in the incident, painting a picture of an attack that did not rest solely on him. But police quickly saw through the inconsistencies. The room bore no evidence of intruders. The only story that matched the evidence was one of domestic violence turned deadly. Officers moved in on Anthony, and soon he was in custody, facing the first steps of what would become a devastating criminal case. Investigators pieced together the timeline, reconstructing the hours leading up to the killing. The knife wounds, the scene inside the hotel room, and Anthony's behavior all pointed to the same conclusion. This was not an accident, not the result of strangers, but an act of intimate partner violence. For Carrie's family, the shock was unbearable. Their daughter and sister, known for her dedication to her children and her warmth toward others, had been killed in a way both brutal and senseless. Her young children, suddenly motherless, became the immediate priority for relatives who had to explain to them what had happened. As the investigation moved forward, more details surfaced about the couple's troubled relationship. Friends said that Carrie had expressed fears about Anthony and that she had been uncertain about the future of their marriage. Those words, in hindsight, added a tragic weight to her story. News of the killing spread quickly through Park City and beyond. Local outlets covered every update, drawing attention not only to the crime itself, but to Anthony's background as a former professional athlete. Headlines reflected the contrast between the life he once lived, cheered on by fans, praised for his athleticism, and the man now accused of murdering his wife. For many, it was difficult to reconcile the image of the linebacker who had worn a Dallas Cowboys jersey, even briefly, with the suspect being led into custody by police. The community in Park City reacted with grief and disbelief. Domestic violence was not unheard of, but this case carried a level of visibility that struck a nerve. The story of a young mother, stabbed to death in a hotel room by the man she had married, resonated deeply. It served as a reminder of the dangers hidden in troubled relationships and the tragic consequences when anger turns into violence. For prosecutors, the case was straightforward but heartbreaking. Their early statements made clear their position. This was a domestic dispute that escalated into lethal violence. They emphasized that Anthony had intentionally taken Carrie's life during an argument, and they had the evidence from the crime scene to support their claim. The knife wounds, the lack of forced entry, and Anthony's conflicting stories painted a clear picture. As Anthony sat in jail, the story of his past came under scrutiny. The football player, who once dreamed of greatness, had already faced personal struggles before 2017. Stories emerged of financial troubles and personal issues, but none of that excused or explained the violence that took Carrie's life. In the months after her death, friends and family held vigils to remember Carrie Casey McClanahan. They spoke of her warmth, her commitment to her children, and the light she brought into people's lives. She was remembered not for the way she died, but for the way she lived. Yet, the brutality of her final moments was impossible to ignore. Her murder became a symbol of how toxic and violent relationships can end, often without warning, and how the cost is measured in stolen lives and grieving families. By the time the case moved closer to trial, the evidence was clear. Anthony's attempts to deflect blame had failed, and the focus was now on how he would face the consequences of what he had done. The story of Carrie's murder was no longer just a crime report. It had become a case that symbolized the destructive power of control, rage, and domestic violence hidden behind closed doors. As the years passed following the death of Carrie Casey McClanahan, the case against her husband Anthony McClanahan slowly reached its conclusion. The investigation had been thorough, the evidence overwhelming, and the story had already captured the attention of both Park City locals and people far beyond Utah. For nearly 2 years, hearings, motions, and legal proceedings kept the case alive in the public eye, each update reopening the pain for Carrie's family and reminding them of the loss they endured. By late 2019, Anthony, once a 46-year-old former professional athlete who had stood in stadiums filled with cheering fans, was now a man facing the consequences of his violent actions. After months of legal maneuvering, he entered a plea that would finally bring closure to the long process. In December of that year, Anthony McClanahan pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The words confirmed what investigators, prosecutors, and Carrie's family had known all along, that he had deliberately stabbed his wife to death during a domestic dispute in their Park Regency hotel room on November 2, 2017. The guilty plea spared the family a long and painful trial, but it also cemented the reality that the man who had once promised to be Carrie's protector had been the one to take her life. For Carrie's relatives, the plea was a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that the truth had finally been accepted by the person responsible, and sorrow that nothing could ever undo what had been done. In January 2020, Anthony McClanahan stood in court for sentencing. The atmosphere in the room was heavy as the judge prepared to deliver the punishment. Prosecutors spoke about the brutality of the crime, reminding the court of the violence Carrie had suffered in her final moments. They described how she had fought for her life, how she had sustained multiple stab wounds, and how the evidence proved the attack had been intentional. They emphasized the impact on her children, left to grow up without their mother, and the unbearable grief of her family. When the sentence was delivered, Anthony McClanahan was given 15 years to life in prison. The punishment reflected both the seriousness of the crime and the lasting harm it had caused. For Anthony, it was the official end of the life he once had. The former football player was now a convicted murderer, facing a future defined by prison walls rather than the freedom and opportunity he once enjoyed. During the hearing, members of Carrie's family spoke about the loss they had suffered. Her relatives described the pain of knowing she would never again see her children grow, never again bring her energy and kindness into the lives of those around her. They remembered her as a loving mother, a woman who had devoted herself to raising her children and pursuing her work in education. Her death had left a void that could never be filled. The story of Anthony and Carrie McClanahan was covered extensively in the media. Headlines emphasized the fall of a former professional athlete and the tragic death of a young woman full of promise. Articles and broadcasts reminded audiences of the stark contrast. A man who had once played for the Dallas Cowboys and later the Canadian Football League had gone from sports fields to prison cells. His name now tied forever to domestic violence and murder. For many, the case symbolized the destructive nature of control and rage within intimate relationships. In Park City, where the murder had taken place, the memory of the crime lingered. Locals who remembered the police cars and flashing lights outside the Park Regency Hotel could not forget the way violence had shattered the peace of their community. The case became a point of reflection on the hidden dangers that exist behind closed doors, even in places that appear safe and quiet. For Carrie's children, the consequences were the most profound. They had lost their mother to violence, and they had also lost the man who was supposed to be their stepfather. Raised by relatives who stepped in to protect and care for them, the children grew up with the shadow of tragedy hanging over their early years. Their mother's name, however, became a symbol of love and strength, remembered by family and friends who refused to let her legacy fade. Anthony's life in prison moved far from the days of football games and athletic accolades. His story became a cautionary tale, often cited in discussions of domestic violence and the dangers of unchecked anger and control in relationships. Where once his identity had been tied to his accomplishments on the field, it was now permanently tied to the murder of his wife. The theme of the McClanahan case is one of betrayal and violence in the most intimate of spaces. A young woman, full of kindness and hope, was killed not by a stranger, but by her husband, the person who should have been her partner and protector. It underscores the hidden reality of domestic violence, the way it can escalate from arguments and control to fatal acts that leave families shattered. The turning point in this case was not only the night of November 2, 2017, but also Anthony's eventual guilty plea. By admitting what he had done, he provided a final answer to the questions that had haunted Carrie's loved ones. But even with that closure, the pain remained. No legal sentence could ever bring Carrie back. No guilty plea could erase the trauma of her final moments. Carrie K.C. McClanahan was remembered not for the way she died, but for the way she lived. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother, and a friend. She was known for her devotion to her children and her commitment to her work in education. Her family and community worked to preserve her memory in positive ways, telling stories of her smile, her generosity, and her dedication. In the years since, the case has stood as a stark reminder of the consequences of domestic violence. It is a story about the fragility of life, the danger of control and rage, and the devastation left behind when a loved one turns violent. For Anthony McClanahan, the story ended in prison. For Carrie's family, the story continues every day as they live with the absence of a young woman whose life was stolen. The Park City Hotel killing remains one of the most haunting crimes in Utah's recent history. It is a case that combines the fall of a once promising athlete with the tragic loss of a young mother, leaving behind lessons about love, control, and the choices that can destroy lives. In the end, the contrast is impossible to ignore. A man who once had everything threw it all away in an act of violence, and a woman who had everything to live for lost her life at his hands. As the years passed following the death of Carrie K.C. McClanahan, the case against her husband Anthony McClanahan slowly reached its conclusion. The investigation had been thorough, the evidence overwhelming, and the story had already captured the attention of both Park City locals and people far beyond Utah. For nearly 2 years, hearings, motions, and legal proceedings kept the case alive in the public eye, each update reopening the pain for Carrie's family and reminding them of the loss they endured. By late 2019, Anthony, once a 46-year-old former professional athlete who had stood in stadiums filled with cheering fans, was now a man facing the consequences of his violent actions. After months of legal maneuvering, he entered a plea that would finally bring closure to the long process. In December of that year, Anthony McClanahan pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The words confirmed what investigators, prosecutors, and Carrie's family had known all along, that he had deliberately stabbed his wife to death during a domestic dispute in their Park Regency hotel room on November 2, 2017. The guilty plea spared the family a long and painful trial, but it also cemented the reality that the man who had once promised to be Carrie's protector had been the one to take her life. For Carrie's relatives, the plea was a mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that the truth had finally been accepted by the person responsible, and sorrow that nothing could ever undo what had been done. In January 2020, Anthony McClanahan stood in court for sentencing. The atmosphere in the room was heavy as the judge prepared to deliver the punishment. Prosecutors spoke about the brutality of the crime, reminding the court of the violence Carrie had suffered in her final moments. They described how she had fought for her life, how she had sustained multiple stab wounds, and how the evidence proved the attack had been intentional. They emphasized the impact on her children, left to grow up without their mother, and the unbearable grief of her family. When the sentence was delivered, Anthony McClanahan was given 15 years to life in prison. The punishment reflected both the seriousness of the crime and the lasting harm it had caused. For Anthony, it was the official end of the life he once had. The former football player was now a convicted murderer, facing a future defined by prison walls rather than the freedom and opportunity he once enjoyed. During the hearing, members of Carrie's family spoke about the loss they had suffered. Her relatives described the pain of knowing she would never again see her children grow, never again bring her energy and kindness into the lives of those around her. They remembered her as a loving mother, a woman who had devoted herself to raising her children and pursuing her work in education. Her death had left a void that could never be filled. The story of Anthony and Carrie McClanahan was covered extensively in the media. Headlines emphasized the fall of a former professional athlete and the tragic death of a young woman full of promise. Articles and broadcasts reminded audiences of the stark contrast. A man who had once played for the Dallas Cowboys and later the Canadian Football League had gone from sports fields to prison cells. His name now tied forever to domestic violence and murder. For many, the case symbolized the destructive nature of control and rage within intimate relationships. In Park City, where the murder had taken place, the memory of the crime lingered. Locals who remembered the police cars and flashing lights outside the Park Regency Hotel could not forget the way violence had shattered the peace of their community. The case became a point of reflection on the hidden dangers that exist behind closed doors, even in places that appear safe and quiet. For Carrie's children, the consequences were the most profound. They had lost their mother to violence, and they had also lost the man who was supposed to be their stepfather. Raised by relatives who stepped in to protect and care for them, the children grew up with the shadow of tragedy hanging over their early years. Their mother's name, however, became a symbol of love and strength, remembered by family and friends who refused to let her legacy fade. Anthony's life in prison moved far from the days of football games and athletic accolades. His story became a cautionary tale, often cited in discussions of domestic violence and the dangers of unchecked anger and control in relationships. Where once his identity had been tied to his accomplishments on the field, it was now permanently tied to the murder of his wife. The theme of the McClanahan case is one of betrayal and violence in the most intimate of spaces. A young woman full of kindness and hope was killed not by a stranger, but by her husband, the person who should have been her partner and protector. It underscores the hidden reality of domestic violence, the way it can escalate from arguments and control to fatal acts that leave families shattered. The turning point in this case was not only the night of November 2, 2017, but also Anthony's eventual guilty plea. By admitting what he had done, he provided a final answer to the questions that had haunted Carrie's loved ones. But even with that closure, the pain remained. No legal sentence could ever bring Carrie back. No guilty plea could erase the trauma of her final moments. Carrie K.C. McClanahan was remembered not for the way she died, but for the way she lived. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother, and a friend. She was known for her devotion to her children and her commitment to her work in education. Her family and community worked to preserve her memory in positive ways, telling stories of her smile, her generosity, and her dedication. In the years since, the case has stood as a stark reminder of the consequences of domestic violence. It is a story about the fragility of life, the danger of control and rage, and the devastation left behind when a loved one turns violent. For Anthony McClanahan, the story ended in prison. For Carrie's family, the story continues every day as they live with the absence of a young woman whose life was stolen. The Park City Hotel killing remains one of the most haunting crimes in Utah's recent history. It is a case that combines the fall of a once promising athlete with the tragic loss of a young mother, leaving behind lessons about love, control, and the choices that can destroy lives. In the end, the contrast is impossible to ignore. A man who once had everything threw it all away in an act of violence, and a woman who had everything to live for lost her life at his hands.